Tibet is the largest roundabout on the planet. If a plane needs to travel from one point to another and Tibet is in the way, it will have to go around it. It won't cross it in a straight line. But why? If crossing it would save time, fuel, and tens of thousands of euros a year, what's the point of avoiding it? The answer lies in a combination of factors that have turned this region into one of the greatest aerial deserts on the planet. To begin with, Tibet isn't a mountain range, it's a plateau. But not just any mountain range. It's the highest on the planet, with an average altitude of 4,500 meters. It's as if you put Spain, France, and the United Kingdom together, and they were almost as high as Mont Blanc. And if that weren't enough, it's surrounded by the highest mountains in the world. In addition to Everest, 13 other mountains are over 8,000 meters high, and dozens more are over 7,000 meters high. And what happens if a plane has a fault mid-flight and loses cabin pressure? Well, it has to come down, and it better be fast. It basically plummets in a controlled manner to reach an altitude where passengers can breathe without a mask. That's usually between 3,000 and 4,000 meters, so we are stuck right on an endless plateau before we can reach that altitude. The emergency masks that drop from the ceiling only last about 15 or 20 minutes. They are designed to give you oxygen just long enough while the plane descends to a safe altitude. But if it can't go far enough because there's a plateau below at 4,500 meters, that margin disappears. You're trapped in an unpressurized cabin, floating above a giant plateau with no clear escape route. And the worst part is, that's not the only problem. Tibet is literally one of the worst places in the world for an emergency landing. Not just because of the mountains, but because of what's there. Or rather, what's not there between them. In an area as vast as Spain, France, and the United Kingdom, there are barely a handful of commercial airports. And those few airports aren't exactly conventional. They're in the middle of mountains at more than 3,000 or 4,000 meters above sea level. And that has a series of consequences that lead to higher landing speeds. To give you an idea, the higher the runway, the faster the plane moves when it touches down, even if the speedometer reads the same. And why? Because at high altitudes, the air is less dense, and the plane needs more real air speed to stay in the air. In Madrid, you can land at about 250 kilometers per hour. But in La Paz, Bolivia, at more than 4,000 meters, that same plane touches down at more than 300 kilometers per hour. And the same thing happens in Tibet, with the added bonus that many runways are short. There can be ice and crosswinds. During World War II, the Allies tried to fly from India to China, partially crossing this region in a journey of just 800 kilometers. In theory, that's a quick trip, but in practice, it was an airplane crusher. Fuel froze, winds could reach 300 kilometers per hour, turbulence was savage, there were no emergency runways. And to top it all off, they were sometimes even attacked by Japanese. The result? More than 500 planes and 1,600 crew members lost. To give you an idea, that route had more Allied casualties than the famous air battle, the Battle of Britain. And it may be tough facing the British, but it shouldn't be tough facing the English. Many people have plenty of vocabulary, but they get stuck on pronunciation, or simply don't know how to say a word. Also dangerous. The Himalayas act as a gigantic wall that disrupts the flow of wind and creates serious turbulence. But I'm not talking about the typical jolt that makes you spill your coffee. I'm talking about vertical currents so powerful they can move a commercial airplane like a kite. This creates what pilots call wind shear, sudden changes in wind direction and speed, capable of destabilizing an airplane in a matter of seconds. Furthermore, at those altitudes, the cold is extreme. The outside temperature can drop to minus 50 degrees. And airplane kerosene begins to freeze at minus 47 degrees. It's true that airplanes have systems to heat the fuel, but after 6 or 7 hours of flying over icy areas, that starts to pose a real risk. A half-frozen tank at 10,000 meters in the middle of Tibet isn't exactly what you want to experience. And if all this weren't enough, add the technological problems. Today's airplanes have GPS, radar, sensors, and satellite communications. But over Tibet, many of these things don't work as well. Radar coverage from the ground is almost non-existent. Air traffic control is minimal.
And if something goes wrong, organizing an emergency response is an odyssey. You could literally be flying in an area with no radar, no coverage, and no one on the other end to hear if a pilot calls Mayday. And when it comes to rescues, things don't get any better. Conventional helicopters don't fly well above 4,000 or 5,000 meters. The air is so thin that the propellers don't generate enough lift. In the Himalayas, Nepalese and Swiss pilots have successfully rescued between 6,000 and 7,000 meters. But only with specially modified helicopters and in near-perfect conditions. These are rare, extreme, and extremely dangerous operations. In 2018, a Sichuan Airlines plane took off from Chongqing bound for Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. Mid-flight, a window broke and the plane suffered a depressurization. The pilot had to immediately turn around and make an emergency landing in Chengdu.
Managed to do so because they hadn't yet entered the Tibetan Plateau. If that failure occurred half an hour later, we would likely be talking about a very different and much more tragic story. And if that weren't enough, Tibetan airspace is completely controlled by the Chinese government. And if there's one thing China doesn't tolerate well, it's anyone flying through its skies as if they were in their own country. Foreign airlines have to ask permission to cross certain areas, and they don't always get it. Sometimes it's for technical reasons, other times for political reasons, and sometimes simply because they don't feel like it. Furthermore, Tibet is a military hotspot. It's right next to India, a country with which China maintains constant tensions. In fact, in 2020, the border between Tibet and Ladakh was the scene of a surreal clash. Soldiers from both sides threw stones at each other, causing casualties on both sides. In that context, China prefers to keep the skies clear and free of unnecessary traffic. That's why, although in theory more direct routes could be drawn up across Tibet, many airlines don't even bother trying. Because a no from Beijing can translate into hours of delay, longer routes, or even being left without permission to operate in the country. Now, technically there are flights that pass through Tibet, but they are very few, and none cross it from end to end, much less fly at night. In general, they are internal flights operated by Chinese airlines, with adapted planes and pilots specifically trained for those conditions. They are usually relatively short routes where there is no way to avoid the plateau, such as those connecting Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, with other Chinese cities. And how much does it cost the airlines not to be able to fly in a straight line? A flight from London to Bangkok, for example, save about 500 kilometers if it crossed into Tibet. That translates to about 40 minutes less flight time and, depending on the plane, more than 5,000 euros in fuel savings per leg. If you fly that route every day, at the end of the year, you've lost a fortune just by taking the detour. But they still do it, because losing money is always better than missing a plane. And now you might be thinking, okay, but the Andes are also high, and can they fly there? The Andes have very high peaks. Aconcagua reaches almost 7,000 meters. But they don't form an entire plateau above 4,500 meters like Tibet. Besides, South America has large cities, major airports, and decent infrastructure. Lima, La Paz, Santiago, Bogota. If something goes wrong, there are options. You're not lost in the middle of nowhere. The same goes for the Alps. Lower altitudes, more stable routes, well-coordinated air traffic control, and multiple alternatives in case of emergency. Tibet is higher, more isolated, and much more hostile. What if all that were to change one day? What if they built airports at 4,000 meters with reinforced runways, modern control centers, and air rescue stations? In theory, yes, it would be possible. But in practice, it would cost tens of billions. All that to save just 30 or 40 minutes per flight. It's not worth it, really. For all these reasons, airplanes don't fly over Tibet. So if you ever decide to fly across Tibet, my advice is to fly to the other side.